Springfield, Missouri, in the late 19th century was a city caught between two worlds. The frontier days were fading, replaced by the steady march of industrialization. Brick buildings rose along Commercial Street, while wooden homes still dotted the outskirts. The population had swelled to nearly 20,000 residents, a mix of families who had lived there for generations and newcomers seeking opportunity in the expanding railroad industry. The city prided itself on being civilized, modern, a place where culture and progress walked hand in hand. Churches stood on every other corner, their steeples reaching toward the sky. Schools educated the children of merchants and laborers alike, and when summer arrived, bringing with it the heat and humidity that made clothes stick to skin, the people of Springfield looked forward to entertainment that would break the monotony of daily life. On June 15, 1896, the Caldwell Brothers Circus rolled into town. Posters had appeared weeks earlier, plastered on every available surface. Bold letters promised wonders, acrobats who defied gravity, exotic animals from distant lands, and performers whose talents would astound even the most skeptical viewer. Children begged their parents for permission to attend. Fathers calculated whether the family budget could accommodate the 25-cent admission price. Mothers packed picnic baskets, planning to make a full day of the event. The circus set up on a vacant lot near the railroad tracks, where the grass had been trampled flat by previous gatherings. Workers erected the big top with practiced efficiency, their movements synchronized after years of repetition. The canvas stretched upward, supported by thick wooden poles driven deep into the Missouri soil. Red and white stripes caught the sunlight, visible from blocks away. Around the main tent, smaller structures appeared. Ticket booths, concession stands, cages for the animals. The smell of sawdust mixed with the scent of popcorn and roasted peanuts. By late afternoon, a crowd had gathered, waiting for the gates to open. Among the performers preparing for that evening's show was Leonard Harker. He had been with the Caldwell Brothers Circus for 3 years, hired in Kansas City after the previous clown had broken his leg in an accident. Leonard was 32 years old, of average height and build, with brown hair that he kept neatly trimmed. When he wasn't in costume, nothing about his appearance attracted particular attention. He dressed simply, spoke softly, and kept mostly to himself. The other performers found him pleasant enough, though distant. He never joined them for drinks after shows, never shared stories about his past, never formed the kind of bonds that develop among people who spend months traveling together. But when Leonard put on his makeup and costume, something changed. His face became a canvas of white grease paint, with exaggerated red lips curved into a perpetual smile and blue diamonds painted around his eyes. He wore a yellow silk suit with oversized buttons, a ruffled collar, and shoes 3 sizes too large. A wig of orange curls completed the transformation. As Jolly Joe, he became someone else entirely. He juggled, performed pratfalls, squirted water from a fake flower, and made balloon animals for delighted children. His timing was impeccable, his physical comedy genuinely funny. Parents laughed as hard as their children. The circus owner, William Caldwell, considered Leonard one of his most valuable performers. That first night in Springfield, the show went exactly as planned. Nearly 800 people crowded into the tent, sitting on wooden benches arranged in concentric circles around the performance area. The ringmaster, dressed in a red coat with gold buttons, welcomed everyone with booming enthusiasm. Then came the parade of performers, bareback riders galloping in circles, their bodies balanced impossibly on the backs of white horses, trapeze artists swinging high above the crowd, catching each other with split-second precision, a strong man lifting weights that seemed beyond human capability, and through it all, Leonard Harker as Jolly Joe, providing comic relief between acts. Children pointed and laughed when he pretended to trip over his own feet. They shrieked with delight when he pulled an endless string of handkerchiefs from his pocket. They clapped when he invited a boy from the audience to help with a magic trick, then pretended the trick had gone wrong, producing a rubber chicken instead of a rabbit. Leonard moved through the routine he had performed hundreds of times, his smile never wavering, his eyes scanning the crowd with what seemed like genuine warmth. But if anyone had looked closely, they might have noticed something unsettling in those eyes. Behind the makeup and the laughter, behind the practiced movements and rehearsed jokes, there was an emptiness, a coldness. Leonard Harker was studying the audience, not to gauge their enjoyment, but for another purpose entirely. He was selecting, evaluating, planning. And when his gaze fell on certain individuals, it lingered just a moment too long. That night, as families left the circus grounds, laughing and recounting their favorite moments, they had no idea that some of them had already been marked. Leonard Harker had chosen his first victim. Margaret Sullivan was 43 years old, a widow who lived alone in a modest house on Olive Street. Her husband had died 2 years earlier from pneumonia, leaving her with a small inheritance and a paid-off home. She worked as a seamstress, taking in mending and alterations from neighbors who appreciated her skill with a needle. Her days followed a predictable pattern: wake at dawn, prepare a simple breakfast, work until midday, eat lunch, work until early evening, prepare dinner, read by lamplight, and sleep. She attended services at the Methodist Church every Sunday and kept a tidy garden behind her house, where she grew vegetables and herbs. Margaret had attended the circus on opening night with her sister's family. She had laughed at the clowns' antics, applauded the acrobats, and marveled at the performing elephants. The outing had been a rare break from her routine, a chance to feel something other than the loneliness that had become her constant companion since her husband's death. She had returned home that night feeling lighter than she had in months, humming one of the songs the band had played. 3 days later, on June 18th, Margaret failed to appear at morning services. Her absence was noted by several church members who knew her punctuality to be absolute. When she didn't answer her door that afternoon, a neighbor became concerned enough to fetch the sheriff. Deputy Thomas Crawford arrived with a ring of keys he kept for emergencies, prepared to find an elderly woman who had perhaps fallen and injured herself. What he found instead would haunt him for the rest of his life. Margaret Sullivan lay in her bed, dressed in her nightgown, her arms folded neatly across her chest. At first glance, she appeared to be sleeping peacefully, but as Crawford stepped closer, his lantern illuminating the scene, he saw the truth. Her throat had been cut with such force that the wound gaped open, exposing the severed vessels beneath. Blood had soaked into the mattress and pooled on the floor beside the bed. The walls bore splatter marks that spoke of violent arterial spray, and on her face, painted in what Crawford would later learn was theatrical makeup, was a grotesque smile. Red grease paint had been applied to her lips, extending the corners of her mouth up toward her ears in a parody of joy. Crawford stumbled backward, his stomach lurching. He had served as a lawman for 12 years and had seen death in various forms: shootings, stabbings, accidents, suicides. But this was different. This was calculated, theatrical. Someone had killed Margaret Sullivan and then stayed to arrange her body, to paint that horrible smile, to create a scene that was equal parts murder and performance. The sheriff, Robert Hayes, arrived within the hour. He was a practical man in his 50s, with grey hair and a weathered face that reflected decades of dealing with human nature at its worst. He walked through Margaret's house methodically, taking notes, looking for anything that might point toward the killer's identity. The back door lock had been forced, the wood around it splintered where someone had used a tool to pry it open. Inside, nothing appeared to have been stolen. Margaret's purse sat on the kitchen table, coins still inside. Her jewelry box remained undisturbed. This had not been a robbery. Hayes questioned the neighbors. No one had heard screaming or sounds of struggle. No one had seen strangers lurking in the area. Margaret had been well liked, with no known enemies. She lived quietly, bothered no one, caused no trouble. The last person to see her alive had been a customer who had picked up an altered dress on the evening of June 17th. Margaret had seemed perfectly normal, perhaps even happier than usual. The coroner, Dr. Edwin Pierce, examined the body and determined that death had occurred sometime between midnight and 3 in the morning on June 18th. The weapon had been extremely sharp, likely a straight razor or similar blade. The killer had approached from behind while Margaret slept, covering her mouth to prevent screaming, then delivering the fatal cut in a single swift motion. Death would have come quickly, though not instantly. There would have been perhaps 30 seconds of consciousness, 30 seconds of terror and pain, and the awful knowledge of what was happening. But what troubled Dr. Pierce most was the smile. The grease paint had been applied with care, the lines precise and deliberate. This wasn't the work of someone acting in panic or rage. This was someone who had taken their time, who had sat beside a dying or dead woman and carefully painted her face. Someone who found meaning or satisfaction in this bizarre ritual. News of the murder spread through Springfield like wildfire. By the following morning, everyone knew what had happened. Fear settled over the city like a fog. Women checked their locks twice before bed. Men kept weapons close at hand. Parents pulled their children indoors earlier than usual. The circus, which had been playing to packed crowds every night, suddenly found attendance dropping. Some people whispered that perhaps the killer was connected to the traveling show, that maybe one of those outsiders who had come to town was responsible. Sheriff Hayes considered the possibility. He visited the circus grounds and questioned the performers and workers. Everyone had alibis, stories of where they had been that night. Most had been together, sleeping in the cramped quarters of their wagons or sharing tents. Leonard Harker, when questioned, explained calmly that he had been in his wagon, alone as always, sleeping after the exhaustion of performing. No one could confirm his story, but no one could contradict it either. The circus remained in Springfield for another week, as scheduled. William Caldwell, the owner, considered leaving early to avoid the growing association between his show and the murder, but he had contracts with local businesses and commitments that couldn't easily be broken. Besides, he reasoned, one of his performers being questioned didn't mean one of them was guilty. The sheriff had no evidence, only suspicion born from the unfortunate timing of their arrival. Leonard Harker continued to perform every night. He painted his face, put on his costume, and entertained crowds that had grown noticeably smaller. If he felt any concern about being questioned by law enforcement, he didn't show it. His routines remained flawless, his timing impeccable, his smile as wide and fixed as ever. But backstage, between acts, he had grown even quieter than usual. He sat alone in his wagon, door closed, speaking to no one unless spoken to first. On June 22nd, 4 days after Margaret Sullivan's body was discovered, the killer struck again. This time the victim was Thomas Brennan, a 40-year-old clerk who worked at the First National Bank of Springfield. Thomas lived with his wife, Catherine, and their 3 children in a 2-story house on Jefferson Avenue. He was known as a reliable employee, a devoted father, and an active member of the community. He sang in the church choir, helped organize the annual 4th of July celebration, and had never been involved in any kind of trouble. On the evening of June 21st, Thomas had attended the circus with 2 colleagues from the bank. They had gone as a group, their wives declining to join them given the recent murder. The men had enjoyed the show, particularly the clown's performance, which had provided much-needed levity during a tense week. Thomas had returned home around 10 o'clock, kissed his sleeping children, and told his wife about the evening before they both retired to bed. Catherine Brennan woke the next morning to find her husband's side of the bed empty. This was unusual but not alarming. Thomas sometimes rose early to prepare for work, but when she went downstairs and found the kitchen empty, the coffee pot cold, she felt the first stirrings of concern. She searched the house and found him in his study, slumped in his desk chair. Her screams brought the neighbors running. By the time Sheriff Hayes arrived, Catherine had been sedated by the family doctor, her children taken to a relative's home. The scene in the study was horrifyingly familiar. Thomas Brennan's throat had been cut with the same brutal efficiency as Margaret Sullivan's. Blood covered the desk, dripped onto the floor, stained the papers he had been reading. And on his face, that same grotesque painted smile, red grease paint extending the corners of his mouth in a mockery of happiness. Hayes felt a cold weight settling in his chest. One murder could be an isolated incident, the work of someone with a personal grudge. 2 murders, committed in the same manner, with the same bizarre signature, meant something far worse. Springfield had a serial killer, someone who was selecting victims and murdering them according to a pattern only he understood. The sheriff assembled every available deputy and began a systematic investigation. They interviewed Catherine Brennan, who could provide little useful information. She had heard nothing during the night, seen no signs of forced entry, noticed nothing unusual. The killer had apparently entered through an unlocked window in the study, approached Thomas from behind while he sat reading, and killed him exactly as he had killed Margaret Sullivan. Then he had taken the time to paint that smile before vanishing back into the night. Hayes examined both crime scenes for connections. The victims had been different ages, different genders, lived in different parts of town, moved in different social circles. Margaret had been a widow living alone. Thomas had been surrounded by family. Margaret had been killed in her bedroom, Thomas in his study. The only common element was that both had attended the circus in the days before their deaths. This realization sent Hayes back to the circus grounds with renewed urgency. He questioned every performer again, this time with specific focus on their whereabouts on the night of June 21st. The answers were frustratingly similar to before. Most had been together. A few had been alone. None could provide concrete alibis that could be verified by outside witnesses. Leonard Harker, once again, claimed to have been asleep in his wagon. Alone. No witnesses. He answered Hayes's questions with calm politeness, never becoming defensive or evasive. He expressed appropriate shock and horror at the news of another murder. He even offered sympathy for the victims' families, but there was something in his demeanor that Hayes found unsettling. A flatness, an absence of genuine emotion beneath the surface expressions. Hayes had no evidence to arrest anyone. No witnesses had seen anyone suspicious near either crime scene. No physical evidence connected any circus performer to the murders. The grease paint used to create the smiles was a common theatrical makeup available in any city. The weapon had never been found. The killer left no fingerprints, no footprints, nothing that could lead investigators to his identity. By June 23rd, panic had fully gripped Springfield. People who had initially dismissed the first murder as a tragic anomaly now understood they were facing something far more dangerous. Hardware stores sold out of locks and bolts. Gun shops reported increased sales. Families barricaded themselves indoors after sunset. The streets, usually busy with evening strollers and socializing neighbors, became deserted. The circus closed early that week, unable to draw sufficient crowds to justify the expense of performing. William Caldwell made arrangements to leave Springfield ahead of schedule, heading to their next contracted stop in Joplin. The performers packed their wagons, dismantled the tents, loaded the animals. By June 24th, the Caldwell Brothers Circus had departed, leaving behind a city traumatized by violence and terrified of what might come next. Sheriff Hayes believed, or perhaps hoped, that the murders would stop once the circus left town. His theory, shared by many residents, was that the killer had been among the traveling performers. With them gone, Springfield could return to normal. Families could sleep without fear. The investigation would continue, but the immediate threat had passed. For 2 weeks it seemed he might be right. No new murders occurred. The city began to relax, cautiously at first, then with growing confidence. People returned to their routines. Businesses that had seen a sharp decline in customers started to recover. Parents allowed their children to play outside again. The memory of Margaret Sullivan and Thomas Brennan remained, but the acute terror began to fade. Then, on July 9th, the killer struck for the third time. The victim was Sarah Mitchell, a 28-year-old schoolteacher who lived in a boarding house on Walnut Street. Sarah had moved to Springfield from St. Louis 2 years earlier, accepting a position at the elementary school on Grant Avenue. She was dedicated to her students, known for staying late to help those who struggled with their lessons. She spent her free time reading, writing letters to her family, and attending poetry readings at the public library. Sarah's body was discovered by the boarding house owner, Mrs. Ida Patterson, when she went to collect the weekly rent. Sarah had failed to appear for breakfast that morning, which was unusual enough to warrant checking on her. Mrs. Patterson knocked, received no answer, and used her master key to enter. The scene was identical to the previous murders in every significant detail. Sarah lay in her bed, throat cut, blood everywhere, and that painted smile transforming her face into something nightmarish. Mrs. Patterson's screams brought other boarders running. By the time Sheriff Hayes arrived, word was already spreading through the streets. The killer hadn't left with the circus after all. He was still in Springfield. He was still hunting. Hayes examined Sarah's room with growing desperation. The killer had entered through a window left open to catch the evening breeze. He had approached while she slept, struck with the same swift brutality, then performed his grotesque ritual with the grease paint. The timeline suggested the murder had occurred around 2 in the morning on July 9th. The sheriff's investigation revealed that Sarah had attended the circus on its final night in Springfield, June 23rd. She had gone with 2 other teachers, treating themselves to an evening of entertainment before summer break. This confirmed the pattern. All 3 victims had attended the circus before their deaths, but with the circus long gone, this information felt useless. Hayes began to consider a possibility he had been avoiding. The killer wasn't a circus performer at all. Instead, he was someone local, someone inspired by the circus's presence to begin his twisted campaign. Perhaps he had attended performances, become fixated on the clown's painted smile, and decided to recreate it in blood and makeup. This theory was somehow more disturbing than the idea of a traveling murderer. It meant the threat was permanent, embedded in the community itself. The sheriff organized search parties that combed through the city, looking for any sign of the killer or his hiding place. They checked abandoned buildings, questioned transients, investigated anyone who seemed suspicious or out of place. Hayes personally interviewed dozens of people, searching for anyone who might have knowledge of theatrical makeup, anyone with a history of violence, anyone whose behavior had changed in recent weeks. The investigation turned up nothing useful. No one had seen anything. No one knew anything. The killer moved through Springfield like a ghost, invisible and untouchable, striking when and where he pleased. On July 16th, he claimed his 4th victim. James Corbett was a 55-year-old blacksmith who operated a shop on Commercial Street. He was a large man, strong from decades of physical labor, with hands that could bend iron, and a reputation for being able to handle himself in any situation. If anyone seemed capable of fighting off an attacker, it was James Corbett. But strength meant nothing against a blade in the darkness. James was found in his workshop, where he sometimes slept during hot summer nights when the house he shared with his adult son became unbearable. The killer had entered through the shop's back door, which James had apparently left unlocked, confident in his ability to defend himself if needed. That confidence had been fatal. The murder followed the now familiar pattern: throat cut, blood everywhere, painted smile. But there was one new detail that made Hayes's blood run cold. The killer had left a message, written in grease paint on the wall above James's body. 4 words in precise theatrical letters: "The show must continue." This changed everything. The killer wasn't just murdering for whatever twisted satisfaction he derived from the act itself. He was performing, creating a series of linked events that he saw as a show, with himself as the star. The victims were props. The city was his audience, and he had just announced his intention to keep going. Hayes called in help from the state, requesting additional investigators and resources. Missouri's governor, responding to pressure from terrified citizens and newspaper editorials demanding action, authorized a special task force. Detectives arrived from Kansas City and St. Louis, bringing experience with complex criminal investigations that Hayes's small department lacked. They reviewed everything: the crime scenes, the witness statements, the physical evidence, the victimology. They developed profiles, constructed timelines, mapped locations. They were thorough, professional, and ultimately no more successful than Hayes had been. The killer left no useful clues. His choice of victims seemed random, connected only by their attendance at the circus weeks earlier. His ability to enter and exit homes without being seen suggested either extraordinary luck or careful planning. By late July, Springfield had become a city under siege. Many families left, moving to stay with relatives in other towns until the crisis passed. Those who remained lived in constant fear. Trust evaporated. Neighbors looked at each other with suspicion, wondering if someone they knew might be the monster hiding among them. The economy suffered as businesses closed or reduced hours. The social fabric that held the community together began to fray. Leonard Harker had left Springfield with the circus on June 24th, but he had never truly departed. While the Caldwell Brothers Circus traveled to Joplin and performed under the big top for new audiences, Leonard had slipped away in the night. He told no one of his plans. He simply packed a small bag with clothing, makeup, and the straight razor he had inherited from his father, and walked into the darkness, He returned to Springfield by freight train, hiding in an empty boxcar among crates of manufactured goods. The journey took less than a day. By June 26th, he was back in the city that had become his hunting ground, renting a room under a false name in a run-down boarding house on the south side of town, far from the neighborhoods where his victims had lived. Leonard had discovered something about himself during those first 2 murders. He had discovered purpose. For most of his life, he had felt empty, disconnected from the world around him. He moved through days without genuine emotion, performing the actions expected of him but feeling nothing authentic beneath the surface. Other people seemed to experience life with an intensity he couldn't comprehend. They loved, hated, feared, hoped. Leonard felt only a vast blankness, a void where emotions should have existed. But when he killed, something changed. In those moments when he held the razor, when he felt the resistance of flesh giving way beneath the blade, when he watched the light fade from his victim's eyes, he felt alive, real, connected to something larger than his own emptiness. The act of taking life filled the void inside him, if only temporarily, and the smiles he painted afterward were his signature, his way of transforming murder into performance. As a clown, he had learned that appearances mattered more than reality. People believed what they saw. If he smiled, they thought he was happy. If he painted a smile on a corpse, he was creating a performance piece, turning death into theater. The victims became his props, their homes his stage, and the terror he spread through Springfield was his applause. After killing Sarah Mitchell, Leonard had felt the familiar emptiness beginning to return. 1 week. That was how long the satisfaction lasted before the void reasserted itself, demanding to be filled again. He had walked through Springfield streets during those 7 days, observing the fear he had created. People hurried home before dark. They checked over their shoulders. They whispered about the monster in their midst. Their terror was intoxicating, proof of his power, evidence that he could affect the world in meaningful ways. When he selected James Corbett as his 4th victim, Leonard had added something new to his ritual. The message on the wall was a declaration, an announcement that he had no intention of stopping. Let them bring in detectives from the big cities. Let them organize search parties and increase patrols. None of it mattered. He was smarter than all of them, more careful, more patient. He would continue his show until he decided to end it, not before. Leonard spent his days carefully planning each murder. He would identify potential victims by walking through different neighborhoods, observing houses and routines. He looked for people who lived alone or whose families might be away. He noted which windows were left open, which doors were poorly secured, which streets had the fewest gas lamps. He attended the same churches his victims attended, shopped in the same stores, creating opportunities to observe them without attracting attention. At night, he would sit in his rented room and apply his makeup, transforming his face into Jolly Joe's grinning visage. He would stare at himself in the mirror, studying the painted smile, feeling the familiar dissociation between his appearance and his interior emptiness. Then he would wash it off and prepare for his next performance, the one that would take place in someone's home, with an audience of one who would never live to describe what they had seen. By early August, Leonard had selected his 5th victim. Her name was Emma Pritchard, a 36-year-old nurse who worked at Springfield's new hospital. Emma lived alone in a small house on Pine Street, having never married despite being considered attractive and personable by those who knew her. She devoted herself to her work, often taking extra shifts to care for patients who had no family to sit with them. Leonard had first noticed Emma at the market, where she shopped for groceries every Saturday morning. He had followed her home at a distance, noting her route, the location of her house, the layout of the surrounding area. Over the following weeks, he had observed her routine. She worked long hours, returned home exhausted, often left her bedroom window open to catch the breeze, and slept deeply. On the night of August 3rd, Leonard approached Emma's house with the confidence of someone who had done this before, and knew he would succeed again. He carried his straight razor in his coat pocket, along with the tin of grease paint he had stolen from the circus. The streets were empty. People had learned to stay indoors after dark. Gas lamps cast pools of yellow light at intervals, but there were long stretches of shadow between them, where a man could move unseen. He climbed through Emma's bedroom window with practiced ease, making no more sound than a whisper of fabric against wood. She slept on her back, one arm draped across her forehead, her breathing deep and regular. Leonard stood beside her bed for a moment, studying her face in the moonlight that filtered through the curtains. She looked peaceful, innocent, unaware that these were her final seconds of life. He moved quickly, covering her mouth with his left hand, while his right hand brought the razor across her throat in one smooth motion. Her eyes flew open, wide with shock and terror and incomprehension. She tried to scream against his palm, tried to fight, but her strength was fading as rapidly as the blood pumping from her severed arteries. Leonard held her down until the struggling stopped, until her eyes glazed over, and she became still. Then he lit the lamp beside her bed and took out his grease paint. He worked carefully, painting the smile with the same attention to detail he had once used for his circus performances. When he finished, he stepped back to admire his work. Emma Pritchard would be found wearing an expression of joy, her death transformed into dark comedy. Her final moment turned into his theatre. Leonard left the house the same way he had entered, climbing back through the window and disappearing into the shadows. Emma Pritchard's body was discovered the following morning, when she failed to report for her scheduled shift at the hospital. The head nurse, concerned by this unprecedented absence, sent an orderly to check on her. What he found sent him running into the street screaming for help. Sheriff Hayes arrived to find a crowd gathering outside Emma's house, kept back by 2 deputies who had secured the scene. He entered alone, steeling himself for what he knew he would see. The 5th victim, the 5th painted smile. The 5th time this monster had struck, while Hayes and his expanded team of investigators had been powerless to stop him. But this time there was something different. Leonard had made his first mistake. In his confidence, in his certainty that he was untouchable, he had grown careless. When he had climbed through Emma's window, a button from his coat had caught on a rough edge of wood and torn free, falling to the floor beneath the window. Hayes found it during his meticulous examination of the scene. It was a distinctive button, made of brass with an unusual pattern etched into its surface. Not the kind of button found on ordinary clothing, but the type used on theatrical costumes. Hayes held it up to the light, feeling the first stirring of hope he had experienced in weeks. This was evidence. Physical evidence that connected the killer to the circus, to theatrical performance, to everything Hayes had suspected but been unable to prove. He sent the button to investigators in Kansas City with an urgent request. Find out where buttons like this were manufactured and sold. Who bought them? What kind of costumes used them? The answer came back within days. The button was part of a batch sold exclusively to theatrical supply companies that catered to circus performers. Further investigation revealed that the Caldwell Brothers Circus had purchased buttons matching this exact description for costume repairs during their spring tour. Hayes felt pieces clicking into place. The killer was connected to the circus. He had likely been one of the performers, someone with access to grease paint and theatrical supplies, someone who had been in Springfield during the first 2 murders and had somehow remained behind when the circus left. Hayes obtained a list of everyone who had been with the circus in June and began the painstaking process of tracking them down. Most were still traveling with the show, which had moved on to Kansas, then Oklahoma, then Texas. But there was one name that stood out: Leonard Harker, the clown. Jolly Joe. According to William Caldwell, Leonard had disappeared on June 24th, the same night the circus left Springfield. He had simply vanished without explanation, without collecting his final pay, without saying goodbye to anyone. Hayes obtained a photograph of Leonard from Caldwell, a formal portrait taken the previous year for promotional materials. He showed it to witnesses who lived near the various crime scenes, asking if anyone had seen this man in the weeks surrounding the murders. Most couldn't say with certainty. Leonard's face was ordinary enough to blend into any crowd. But one witness, an elderly woman who lived across the street from James Corbett's blacksmith shop, said the face looked familiar. She thought she might have seen him walking past several times in the days before James was killed. It wasn't proof. It wasn't enough to secure a conviction. But it was a lead, the first real lead they had. Hayes distributed copies of Leonard's photograph to every law enforcement agency in Missouri, along with a detailed description and a warning that he was extremely dangerous. He organized raids on boarding houses and hotels, searching for any sign of where Leonard might be hiding. But Leonard had anticipated this possibility. He had always known that eventually someone might connect him to the circus. He had prepared for it by creating a network of hiding places, by using multiple false names, by never staying in one location long enough to become familiar to landlords or neighbors. When Hayes's men kicked in the door of the boarding house where Leonard had been staying, they found only an empty room with no personal belongings, no clues to where he might have gone. Leonard was already planning his departure from Springfield. He had been in the city for more than a month, longer than was wise. The investigation was tightening around him. He could feel it in the increased patrols, the suspicious looks from people on the streets, the sense that his invisible shield was beginning to crack. It was time to move on, to find a new hunting ground where he could continue his work. But first he wanted to deliver one final performance in Springfield, something spectacular, something that would ensure he would never be forgotten. He began planning his most ambitious murder yet, one that would require precision and daring and perfect timing. His target was Sheriff Robert Hayes himself, the man who had been hunting him, who had come closer than anyone else to discovering his identity. Leonard had been observing Hayes for days, learning his routines, noting his habits. The sheriff worked long hours, often staying at his office until late at night reviewing case files and coordinating with other investigators. He lived alone, his wife having died years earlier, his children grown and moved away. He was dedicated, competent, and completely focused on catching the killer who had terrorized his city. Leonard found a kind of professional respect for Hayes. In another context, they might have understood each other, two men committed to their respective crafts. But Hayes stood between Leonard and the continuation of his work. He had become more than just a hunter. He had become a threat, and threats had to be eliminated. On the night of August 10th, Leonard waited in the shadows across from the sheriff's office. He watched as Hayes worked alone inside, visible through the window, bent over his desk with papers spread before him. The building was empty except for the sheriff. His deputies had gone home hours earlier. The street was quiet, the businesses closed, the respectable citizens of Springfield long since locked behind their doors. Leonard crossed the street and tried the office door. Unlocked. Hayes's dedication had made him careless. Leonard slipped inside, moving silently through the front room toward the sheriff's private office. He could see Hayes through the partially open door, still absorbed in his work, unaware that death had entered his domain. But Robert Hayes had not survived 12 years as a lawman by being oblivious to danger. Some instinct, some subtle shift in the air or barely audible sound, alerted him that he was no longer alone. His hand moved toward the revolver holstered at his hip, even as he turned his head toward the door. Leonard stood in the doorway, his straight razor already open and gleaming in the lamplight. For a moment the two men simply looked at each other. Hayes saw a face he recognized from the photograph, but transformed by something that couldn't be captured in a picture, a complete absence of humanity in the eyes that stared back at him. Hayes drew his revolver with the speed of long practice, but Leonard was already moving. He lunged forward, knocking the gun from Hayes's hand before the sheriff could fire. They crashed together, falling against the desk and sending papers flying. Hayes was older, but he was strong and experienced in physical confrontation. He managed to grab Leonard's wrist, preventing the razor from reaching his throat. They struggled in silence, neither man wasting breath on words. Leonard was younger and perhaps had a slight advantage in strength, but Hayes had desperation on his side. This was the man who had murdered 5 people in his city. This was the monster he had been hunting for weeks. Hayes would die before he let Leonard walk out of this office. The razor slashed across Hayes's arm, cutting through fabric and skin. Blood welled up, but Hayes didn't release his grip. He drove his fist into Leonard's face, feeling cartilage crunch under his knuckles. Leonard staggered backward, and Hayes used the moment to recover his revolver from where it had fallen. But as his fingers closed around the gun's grip, Leonard recovered and lunged again. This time, the razor found its target, slashing across Hayes's neck. Not deep enough to sever the major vessels, but deep enough to cause serious damage. Hayes pulled the trigger, even as he felt the blood beginning to pour down his chest. The shot was wild, missing Leonard entirely and burying itself in the wall. Leonard retreated toward the door, his face bleeding from where Hayes had struck him. For the first time since he had begun killing, he had been injured, had been fought, had been forced to flee rather than complete his work. He could hear footsteps pounding on the street outside. The gunshot had alerted people that something was wrong. He ran through the office and out the back door, disappearing into the maze of alleys behind Commercial Street. Hayes collapsed against his desk, one hand pressed to his bleeding neck. Deputies burst through the front door moments later, drawn by the sound of the gunshot. They found their sheriff conscious, but badly wounded, blood pooling on the floor beneath him. He managed to gasp out a description of his attacker before the doctor arrived and began the desperate work of saving his life. The wound to Hayes's neck had missed the carotid artery by less than an inch. Had Leonard's aim been slightly better, or had the struggle gone on a few seconds longer, the sheriff would have become the sixth victim. Instead, he survived, though he would carry the scar for the rest of his life as a reminder of how close death had come. Leonard Harker's attempt to kill Sheriff Hayes proved to be his undoing. For the first time, there had been a witness who had seen him clearly, who could identify him beyond any doubt. Hayes's description was distributed immediately, and every lawman in Missouri now knew exactly who they were hunting. Roadblocks were established on every route out of Springfield. Train stations and freight yards were watched. Hotels and boarding houses were searched systematically. But Leonard had already gone to ground. He had planned for the possibility that his attack on Hayes might fail, and he had prepared a hiding place that no one would think to search. The basement of the abandoned church on the east side of town, a building that had been empty for years after the congregation had built a larger structure closer to the city center. Leonard had discovered it weeks earlier while scouting locations and had stocked it with supplies, food, water, blankets, and most importantly, materials to alter his appearance. He spent 3 days there, hiding while the search intensified above him. He shaved his head and grew out his facial hair, transforming himself from clean-cut to rough and unkempt. He stole workers' clothing from a laundry line, abandoning his circus-bought garments. When he finally emerged, he looked nothing like the man in the photographs that had been plastered across Springfield. Leonard's plan was to make his way to St. Louis, where he could lose himself in a city large enough that one more anonymous face would go unnoticed. But traveling there required money and his funds had run low. He needed one more score, one more opportunity to obtain the cash that would allow him to escape. On August 14th, he broke into a house on Elm Street, choosing it because he had observed the family leaving earlier that day for what appeared to be an extended trip. He searched quickly, looking for cash or valuables he could sell. He found a strongbox in the master bedroom and was working on forcing it open when he heard footsteps on the stairs. The family had returned unexpectedly. The father had forgotten important documents and had come back to retrieve them. He walked into his bedroom and found Leonard kneeling beside the broken strongbox. For a frozen moment, neither man moved. Then Leonard reached for his razor, but this time, his intended victim was prepared. Charles Whitmore was a veteran of the Civil War, a man who had faced death on battlefields and who kept a loaded shotgun beside his bed for exactly this kind of situation. He grabbed it and fired before Leonard could close the distance between them. The blast caught Leonard in the chest, the impact throwing him backward against the wall. He slid down, leaving a smear of blood on the wallpaper, his razor clattering from his hand. Charles stood over him, the shotgun still aimed at his chest, and shouted for his wife to fetch the police. Leonard Harker didn't die immediately. The shotgun blast had done terrible damage, but it had missed his heart. He lay on Charles Whitmore's bedroom floor, blood pooling beneath him, his breathing ragged and wet, while deputies rushed to the scene. They arrived to find Charles still holding the shotgun, his face pale but his hands steady, standing guard over the man who had terrorized Springfield for 2 months. Sheriff Hayes, still recovering from his own wounds, was brought to the scene. He looked down at Leonard Harker and felt a complex mixture of emotions. Relief that the killing had stopped, anger at the lives that had been lost, and a deep, unsettling curiosity about what had driven this man to commit such horrific acts. Leonard was transported to the hospital, where Dr. Pierce worked to stabilize him. The physician's professional obligation to save lives conflicted with his personal knowledge of what this patient had done, but he performed his duty nonetheless. Against expectations, Leonard survived the surgery. The bullet had been removed, the damaged tissue repaired as much as possible. He would live, at least long enough to face trial. He remained unconscious for 3 days, his body fighting infection and trauma. Deputies stood guard outside his room around the clock, ensuring he wouldn't escape, even if he somehow managed to wake and rise from his bed. On August 17th, his eyes finally opened. He looked around the hospital room with the same flat, emotionless expression that had characterized him throughout his murderous campaign. Sheriff Hayes was summoned immediately. He entered the room, his neck still bandaged from Leonard's attack, and sat beside the bed. For several minutes, neither man spoke. Then Hayes asked the question that had been haunting him since this nightmare began: why? Leonard's answer, when it came, was delivered in a quiet, conversational tone that made it somehow more disturbing. He explained about the emptiness he had felt his entire life, the disconnection from normal human emotion, the sense that he was observing life rather than participating in it. He described the rush he felt when he killed, the brief sensation of being real and alive and connected to something larger than himself. He talked about the smiles he painted as if they were works of art, performances meant to transform something brutal into something theatrical. Hayes listened with growing horror. He had expected madness, expected rage or fear or remorse. What he found instead was worse, a complete absence of anything recognizable as human conscience. Leonard spoke about his victims as if they had been objects, props in his performance rather than people with lives and families and futures. He showed no guilt, no regret, no understanding that what he had done was wrong beyond the fact that he had been caught. When Hayes asked about specific victims, Leonard remembered details with disturbing clarity. He described Margaret Sullivan's house, the layout of her bedroom, the way she had looked sleeping peacefully before he killed her. He recalled Thomas Brennan's study, the books on the shelves, the papers on the desk. He spoke about Sarah Mitchell, Emma Pritchard, and James Corbett with the same detached precision. Each murder had been planned carefully, executed efficiently, and remembered with perfect recall. But when Hayes asked about motive, about why Leonard had chosen these specific people, the answer was chillingly simple. They had attended the circus. They had watched him perform as Jolly Joe. They had laughed at his antics, applauded his tricks, smiled at his painted face, and that had been enough to mark them for death. Leonard had wanted an audience for his real performance, and he had selected them from among the crowds who had watched his false one. The trial of Leonard Harker began on September 23rd, 1896. The courtroom was packed with spectators who had come to see the monster who had terrorized their city. Newspaper reporters from across Missouri and neighboring states filled the press gallery, their pencils racing to capture every detail. The prosecution, led by District Attorney William Morrison, presented overwhelming evidence: witness testimony from Sheriff Hayes and Charles Whitmore, the distinctive button found at Emma Pritchard's murder scene, the connection between Leonard and the circus, and most damningly, Leonard's own confession. The defense attorney, appointed by the court because Leonard had no money for private counsel, argued that his client was insane, incapable of understanding the nature of his actions. He brought in doctors who testified about Leonard's flat effect, his emotional disconnection, his inability to feel empathy or remorse. They used terms like moral insanity and psychopathic personality, trying to explain in medical language what Hayes had witnessed firsthand. Leonard Harker lacked something fundamental that made people human, but the prosecution countered effectively. Leonard had planned his murders carefully, had taken steps to avoid detection, had altered his appearance to escape capture. These were the actions of someone who understood exactly what he was doing and knew it was wrong. The fact that he felt no guilt didn't make him insane, it made him evil. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. They returned a verdict of guilty on 5 counts of murder in the first degree. The judge, his face stern and his voice unwavering, sentenced Leonard Harker to death by hanging. The execution was scheduled for November 6, 1896. Leonard showed no reaction to the sentence. He sat quietly in the courtroom, his expression as blank as it had been throughout the trial, as if the verdict concerned someone else entirely. He was led away to a cell in the county jail, where he would spend his remaining weeks waiting for the sentence to be carried out. During those final weeks, Leonard received no visitors except for a priest who came daily to pray for his soul. Leonard tolerated these visits with polite indifference, showing no interest in spiritual redemption or forgiveness. He spent his time sitting on his bunk, staring at the wall, his thoughts unknowable. On the morning of November 6th, 1896, Leonard Harker was led from his cell to the gallows that had been erected in the jail's courtyard. A crowd of official witnesses had gathered, representatives from the courts, law enforcement officials, newspaper reporters, and relatives of the victims who had requested to be present. The sky was overcast, threatening rain, and a cold wind swept through the courtyard. Leonard climbed the steps to the gallows platform without assistance. The executioner placed the noose around his neck and asked if he had any final words. Leonard looked out at the assembled witnesses, and for the first time since his capture, something like emotion flickered across his face. Not remorse, not fear. Something closer to satisfaction. He spoke clearly, his voice carrying across the silent courtyard. The performance is complete. Then the trap door opened and Leonard Harker fell into darkness. His neck broke cleanly, and death was instantaneous. The monster who had terrorized Springfield for 2 months was gone. His reign of terror ended at the end of a rope. But the impact of his crimes would linger far longer than his life. The families of his victims would carry their grief for decades. Sheriff Hayes would wake from nightmares for years, reliving the moment Leonard's razor had slashed across his throat. The city of Springfield would be forever changed, its innocence shattered by the knowledge that evil could hide behind a painted smile and that monsters could walk among us wearing human faces. And in the years that followed, as criminologists and psychologists studied the case of Leonard Harker, they would use it as an early example of what would later be called serial murder, a pattern of killing driven not by passion or profit, but by a void where human emotion should exist. Leonard Harker had been one of the first of his kind to be documented, studied, and understood. But he would not be the last. Every family hides secrets, some so dark they should never see the light of day. Here, we open the doors to those shadowed pasts, uncovering hidden crimes, silent pacts, and stories that echo like ghosts through the halls of memory. If you've made it this far, it means you also carry that forbidden curiosity. So don't hesitate. Subscribe to the channel now, turn on the bell, and follow our next revelations. Because every day, new secrets emerge, and only those who dare to face the truth remain to hear them.